जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम। उम्मीद है कि आप ठीक होंगे। अच्छा जी, एक मिनट दीजिएगा।
uh, uh, to be crunched, but nothing is as informative as hearing directly from a wide range of people engaged in the economy as represented by you. We want to hear the perspective, for example, of those who are helping families get enough to eat, and also that of a farmer and a rancher dealing with challenges of producing that food. We want to hear how workers are feeling about the job market when they post a resume online, and also the perspective of employers who use that online service to try to find workers. The pandemic has had lasting effects on the economy, and we'll hear today how parents are doing finding childcare and how our nursing school is responding to the well-known shortage of nurses. It was around 2 years ago that the surge in goods purchases during the pandemic led to a pivot to service spending and a slowdown in manufacturing. Data on manufacturing can tell us some of what's happening, but we look forward to hearing from our panelists today, who's working closely with hundreds of manufacturing businesses to understand better why that is happening. These Fed Listens events represent our continuing and deep interest in hearing these and other perspectives on how people are faring in the economy and how Fed decisions are affecting that experience. So thank you again all for being part of it. And I hand it off now to my colleague, Governor Mickey Bowman, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair Powell. Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you here this morning, and I'm so pleased to be hosting with my colleagues another Fed Listens event here at the board. It's great to be together in person, and thank you to our board members who are able to be here with us today. I'd also like to thank our 6 panelists for traveling all the way to Washington, D.C. to be here with us today, and for your willingness to share your perspectives on current economic conditions. When we say that our policy decisions are data dependent, people tend to think that we're only referring to the national statistics on employment, inflation, and economic activity. But when FOMC participants come to each policy meeting, they bring to the table a much broader set of information that includes reports gathered from numerous conversations with people across the country, conversations like those that we'll hear today. Over the past few years, the frequency and extent of data revisions, for example, like those that we saw in the most recent employment reports, have made the task of assessing the current state of the economy, as well as predicting how the economy will likely evolve, especially challenging. That's one reason why these Fed Listens conversations continue to be a valuable resource for us as policymakers. They provide important context to the economic data that we consider, and they help us develop a richer understanding of how economic conditions are affecting people in their everyday lives. In doing so, these discussions help us think about how we can best achieve stability and support for the economic well-being of all families. We will have 2 panel discussions this morning, and I'll be moderating the first panel, and Vice Chair Jefferson will be moderating the second panel. Thank you very much, Vice Chair. In our first panel, we'll hear from 3 people who bring direct knowledge and experience about how American families are faring and how they've been adjusting to the economic landscape since the pandemic. Our second panel includes 3 people who represent key industries, including manufacturing, agriculture, and healthcare. So we look forward to hearing from all of you and my fellow board members. I encourage you to ask any follow-up questions that you may have along the way as we have these conversations. But we'll begin with our first panelist on panel 1, Derek Chubbs. Derek is president and CEO of Second Harvest Food Bank in Orlando, Florida, the region's largest hunger relief agency that distributes more than 250,000 meals per day in 6 central Florida counties. He previously led the Central Texas Food Bank in Austin for 5 years. Prior to joining the Food Bank Network, Derek held both regional and national executive roles with the American Red Cross and held senior leadership positions with IBM, Pervasive Software, and Dell. So, Derek, we'll go ahead and get started with our first question. How has food insecurity evolved in your community since our last conversation in
सुन रहा हूँ, कोई
2022?
चीज़ें होती हैं सुनने के लिए, आप भी कोई अकल यूज़ कर लिया करो।
Thank you,
यहाँ पे सिर्फ
Governor,
बैठने के लिए
for
आते हो, सुनो भी कुछ।
having me and everyone else
तभी हमें
that are on
पता
these
चलेगा ना क्या होने
esteemed
जा रहा है।
panels up a second time. So we're more than happy to talk about that. Also, thank you for the work that you've done thus far in controlling, slowing, potentially reversing some of the potential challenges that we were seeing from an economic level. But I want to start with doing two things. In the bio, you referenced that when I was here last, we were distributing the equivalent of 250,000 meals a day. That number is now 300,000 meals a day. And we picked up another county along the way. So my territory grew a little bit. But I also want to add that one other thing has been evolving during that time period. The profile of those who are depending on the charitable food system is evolving as well. We have an idea that when someone's hungry, they're either unemployed or they're homeless, and that was not necessarily the case before the pandemic, and it's even worse today. We're seeing more and more of our friends and neighbors depending on our services that are working, sometimes 2 and 3 jobs. Some own homes, and that's what we're seeing today. So the profile of the typical person depending on our services is evolving along with everything else. Also, from a Florida perspective, we are seeing the long tail of recovery from some of the natural disasters that we've seen as well. And I'm sure that's not just us. That's happening certainly in the South, but across the entire Feeding America network. We're one of 200. So these emergencies hit low income, middle income families who can't even afford to prepare for this in advance. And according to some of the survey data that we've been looking at, around 70% of Americans are basically living paycheck to paycheck. So if that's the case, anything that throws off the system, a flat tire could do something like that if there's no savings. And that's mostly what we're seeing. So while inflation is slowing in many sectors, prices aren't necessarily decreasing at proportionate rate either. So the families that we talk to, and that's back to that 300,000 meals a day, the families that we talk to tell stories around how high or the challenges associated with housing. I talked to one and she said, well, my rent has to eat first. And then after the rent, there are the other fixed costs that are associated with it. So we're finding them using food to help balance a monthly budget. Whether or not I'm going to eat or whether or not I'm not going to eat so that my children eat, or whether we're not going to eat healthy food and we buy the junk food that's not necessarily good for us. So wages haven't necessarily caught up with the rate of inflation. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know already.
सिग्नल दिया हुआ है
But
मार्केट
this is what
73
we're
से
seeing
3 करके
in
ऊपर गई
the
कौन सी चीज
hundreds
समझ
of
नहीं आई आप वो क्वेश्चन मार्क कर देते हो
on a daily basis. So with food being a household budget item, there are all types of decisions that have to be made that are challenging to those that we see today. From a Florida specific perspective, when we speak in terms of those who own homes, the challenges with the cost of insurance and the availability of homeowners insurance, those costs are rising and they have to make up for that. That's the families, that's the senior on a fixed income. That's a major challenge that we're seeing. My homeowner's insurance is up in Florida. So I know this firsthand. We know this firsthand when we go to the grocery store and we see that prices have increased. And with Florida or with Central Florida being a major hospitality town, then we find that so many of those who depend on our services are in the hospitality
अच्छा
industry.
मेरी बात सुने आप जितने भी लोग लाइफ
Forgive
में
my
हैं, एक
personal
चीज मैं आपको थोड़ा
opinion,
सा बताता
if
चलूं
you're
कि
working 40
अभी
plus
जो
hours a week,
बता रहा है ये
I really
क्वेश्चन में
believe
कि
you
भाई
ought to
आप
be
लोगों ने हर चीज
fruitful.
के रेट जो है ना वो इंक्रीज
That we're
किए हुए हैं
talking
तो उसमें
about
उसकी
food
पॉलिसी के ऊपर
at
तो
the end of the
गोल्ड जो
day.
है ना वो आप साइड पे
So
प्रेशर
just
ज्यादा
a
रहेगा
quick
ये चीज ध्यान
recap
में रखिएगा
on
और
the
DXY
question,
थोड़ा
Governor.
बहुत
Well,
नीचे
right before the
डंप हो
pandemic,
सकता है अभी चीजें
in
नोट कर
Central
लें
Florida, we were distributing around 150,000 meals a day before the pandemic. During the pandemic, that number doubled to 300,000 meals a day. What's past when I was here last year, we thought our new normal was going to be
और फ्राइडे वाले दिन बिल्कुल
250,000 meals a day.
कोशिश करें कि ट्रेड्स
But we
ना ही
found
करें तो
last
ज़्यादा
year
बेहतर
that
होती है,
number
करते
had
हैं तो फिर
grown back
किसी
to
लेवल और किसी जोन
300,000.
से ही ट्रेड करें.
And I'm afraid there's no end in sight. So that's how things have kind of evolved in the community since we visited last time. I think it was November of 22. And it's not necessarily a pretty picture. Things are changing, but that's what our folk are seeing.
Great, thank you. And so can you share with us what your outlook is for the coming year and for the financial well-being of the families that you're serving now?
So we're basically in the midst of a perfect storm. It's what I would say. Rent is out of touch with average wages. Families and seniors are living in what used to be efficiency hotels. This is where they find themselves living. I mentioned property insurance, childcare, simple supply and demand. There are just not enough options. So childcare expenses are up. Healthcare, volatile grocery prices, gas and transportation, which we as a food bank and every food bank in the country are challenged with as well.
जी
Because
बिल्कुल
the
ऐसा
cost
ही है.
of
थोड़ी देर
me
बाद
putting
बस
24
मूव कर
trucks on
सकता
the
है.
road every day is a lot different today than it was a few years ago. But I really want to touch on what's on the horizon. On the horizon, this summer, for 10 weeks, our children are not going to have access to the free and reduced lunch programs that they typically see while they're in school. Now, and that's just during the summer. I won't mention after school, weekends, holidays. They just simply don't have access to food. And we're trying to figure out how to do that. 13 million kids across the Feeding America network that we've been able to count aren't sure where their next meal is
30
coming from.
millions.
1 in 5 in Central Florida. That I find that number unacceptable under any stretch of the imagination. One of the things that we're trying to do in Central Florida is we have a very active school market program that has grown considerably since 2022. We have school markets or school programs in 70 of the schools in our service area, 70 schools in our service area, and we have another 30 waiting in the queue to be a part of the program. And we've learned several things. We had one program in particular that would send a child home at night with food to eat for the
जी
evening.
जी ऑटो नहीं है.
Well, we
ये
found that
तो
that
मैं
child,
बैठा हुआ
when
हूँ
he or
अभी,
she took
लेकिन
the
इसके
food
बाद ऑटो
home,
लगाएंगे.
was sharing it with the family. So it wasn't enough food. So we have increased that number. We've increased the amount of pounds or food that we send home. And that's a major challenge for us. And it just breaks my heart because we all know, and my friend Dawn will probably tell you the exact same thing, the challenges that are associated with children who aren't properly nourished. Everything from health issues to not being able to learn and process information appropriately. So right now, that's my biggest fear because that ripple effect is going to hit our children. And we will scale this summer up to another level. I'll take on an additional 15 employees and driving just to hit some of those school programs and fill the gaps. We have 7 schools in our area that don't even have commercial kitchens. So we're providing all the food to those locations. So that's a worry that I have because it's a worry that we have every summer. But I really do not want us to lose track of those that are on the tail end of this thing. And that's our business. So with that point, I want to close on one positive note. This morning, literally this morning, I saw a news report. I haven't read it in its entirety, that rent in Orlando was dropping for the first time since 2021. So I will say thank you for that because I'm sure that's an indication of the work and policies that you're putting forward. And my hope, my prayer is that this continues so those that depend on our services will start to see more of that in their monthly operational exercises.
That's positive news to close on. Would anybody else like to ask a question?
I was just going to say, yours is obviously an industry where increasing market share is not a good thing.
No, not at all. I'm not interested in growing.
Exactly.
Well, without any more questions for our first panelist at the moment, let's move on to Dawn DeStefano, who's our second panelist. Dawn is the president and CEO at Square One. It's a nonprofit organization that provides a range of family-friendly education and support services. Square One's programs include early childhood education and care at centers in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is a home-based care setting located throughout home-based care settings located throughout Greater Springfield, and out-of-school time care for elementary school-age children. Square One's parent education support and training programs are offered through groups, home visitation, and personalized case management to help parents access whatever services they need to be successful in their role as their child's first teacher. So our first question, Dawn, is from your perspective, how has the ability of families to access reliable childcare changed over the past few years, particularly for families at the lower end of the income spectrum?
Sure. Well, thank you, Governor. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for having us here today. My friend Derek, who I think our friendship is all of 5 seconds old, but that's how fast you make friends in this field, is because when you're called to service, and certainly in service of children and families, you make friends quickly. So nice. Thank you for those comments, Derek. I'm compelled to make a comment about the connection
बाय देख रहे हैं ना तो
between
SL
food and
इसके नीचे
children.
रखिएगा
It's really difficult
2162
to
से नीचे
learn. It's actually really difficult to sit
अगर इसको
still
क्रॉस करके तो
when your
216
belly's
से नीचे
empty.
रखिए
And so I really applaud the efforts that you're making in Florida. We certainly see some of the same stories in Massachusetts. So I bring good tidings. I have 500 children currently. I'm looking at the clock. I have 500 children between the ages of 0 and 5 in
बाबे
my
से
care
सवाल
as
पूछी
we
जा रहे
speak.
हैं बाबा के नजर
So although I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., they are being cared for back in
आज
Springfield,
बाबे ने ना सेक्रेटरी
Massachusetts.
रखी हुई
They
है वो
say
जवाब दे रही है
hello.
आज बाबे की जगह में
Many of them, I had a couple that wanted to come with me. We had to look at the map and show them where Washington, D.C. was and explain where Miss Dawn was going. So maybe
आओ
next time
ये
I'll bring one of
बोलते
them
रहते
with
हैं
me. You might enjoy that. As we know, access to childcare is a core tenet for people to be able to access employment, retain employment, and provide for the economic stability of their family. COVID certainly was a decimating factor to childcare, where you're providing services in a congregate way. People are coming together. So certainly that was an interesting
मुझे तो ऐसे
time.
लग रहा है कि
At
गोल्ड जो
Square
है ना
One, we serve the
इस
city of
सपोर्ट को
Springfield in Massachusetts, the third
2176 को
largest city
तोड़ा
in
तो
Massachusetts.
83 और 86 से
But
ड्रॉप हो
it's
जाएगा
not the
ऐसे
richest
लग रहा है
city in Massachusetts. I looked at the state median income in Massachusetts is $96,505. The median income in Springfield is $47,677. That's quite a difference. And so when we think about childcare for those lowest wage workers, it's important for me to realize they need to work 40 hours a week. Earning $47,000 a year is not easy. And then finding childcare. So what we've started to look at in terms of strengthening access for our lowest wage families in Massachusetts is we've started working on reducing the paperwork burden. I realize I'm in DC and probably the IRS is nearby, but we all know that the abundance of paperwork
ये
can be
वैसे
quite
तो SL इसका इधर होना
paralyzing.
चाहिए
And when
लेकिन
you're trying
वो
to
इसलिए
say
कि फेक
yes
स्पाइक
to a
भी लग
job
सकती है और डोर
opportunity,
डाउन जा
it
सकता
can
है
be
इस
very
वजह से एहतियातन
overwhelming
जो
to
होता है
come
ना यहाँ
up
पे पिन
with the
करके भी ऊपर
litany
जा
of
सकते
paperwork necessary to prove that you are eligible for financial assistance. So in Massachusetts, we're working really hard to reduce that paperwork burden. The other thing we're doing is
हैं आज
eliminating
काला बाबा है
the types of household income that
असल में एक
families
तो
rely on
रमजान है
when
ना
there's a
रमजान में जो है ना
disability,
ज्यादातर वो लाइव
your
बोला भी
child
नहीं जाता
support, and things like
और
the money
स्पेशली
that you receive to support the
इस पे
food in
फोकस
your
करें अपनी
household.
ट्रेड्स मिस हो
We're no
जाती हैं
longer counting those towards your household
ज़्यादा
income
इम्पोर्टेंट ये है कि
because,
मैं आपको
again,
थोड़ा सा
it
बताता
sets you
चलूँ
up
कि
for a false narrative. You
चूंकि
end up paying a
फ्राइडे
higher
है और अभी बिल्कुल
childcare
मार्केट
fee
स्टक है
by
लेकिन
counting
ये
those
आप
benefits.
इसको ड्रिल करने की
In
कोशिश कर रहा है
Massachusetts,
इस
we're also
सपोर्ट को ना
increasing the
मेरे
threshold.
नज़दीक 80 के
For
पास तो
years,
जा
we've
सकता है
we've
मार्केट
maintained the
अगर
thresholds
इसको
that
ब्रेक
you
किया तो
would
फिर
earn
थोड़ा सा तेजी के साथ ऊपर की
50%
साइड बढ़
of the
जाएगा,
state
फिर
median
नीचे आएगा।
income to be able to
तो ज़्यादा
qualify
से
for that
ज़्यादा
financial
86 to
assistance.
186 और
Today,
टू
we've increased that to
160 के आसपास
85%.
ही गोल्ड आज
Because
मूव
what we
करेगा।
found in Massachusetts is that half of our families are eligible for financial assistance at that 85% threshold. So those are some of the things we're doing to help our lowest wage families. At square one, I think one of the reasons that I may have caught the attention of folks in Massachusetts is we were trying to identify through the pandemic, what could we do that's different to be able to address some of the challenges our families are facing. And so we started to reach out to some of our largest employers to say, your lowest paid workers, your housekeepers, your patient advocates, your food service workers, the very people you need to keep your hospital flowing, your business open, they rely on childcare. And so what we did is we established sort of a non-traditional arrangement where we said, what if we
जी
provided
गौतम भाई,
backup
आपने बिल्कुल
care
सही बोला
to
है।
your
मैं वैसे भी
employees?
फ्राइडे के जो है
Most
ना वो
people have
फ्राइडे
their
वाले दिन
childcare
ट्रेड के हक में होता
arrangements
ही नहीं हूँ।
already
बहुत
set when
उल्टा
they're
भी करते हैं
working.
बाज दफा,
Where
लोगों का
low-wage
माइंड बाय
families
बना के सेल
struggle
करेंगे, सेल
is
बना
when
के बाय
that
करेंगे।
one
एसएमसी यही
childcare
चीज नोट
option
करती है।
isn't
तो
available.
ज्यादा बेहतर
And
यही
during
होता है
COVID, we
कि
saw that happen.
फ्राइडे वाले दिन जो है ना वो
Where
एहतियाती
mom got
ट्रेड
sick,
कीजिए। मेरा तो यही होता है कि
babysitter was
न्यूज
sick,
सेशन से पहले
and
पहले आप अपना
can't go to
टारगेट
work
होता भी है, वैसे तो
because you
टारगेट
don't
रखना ही
have
नहीं
a
चाहिए
plan B.
फॉरेक्स मार्केट के
So
अंदर।
at Square
मंथली
One, we
जो भी
created
परसेंटेज सेट
that
करो वो
plan
ठीक है,
B with our
लेकिन
largest
ये डेली वाला जो है
employers
ना
since
काम बड़ा खराब
COVID.
होता है।
We
तो उसमें
said
लेके आप लोग
every
निकलें, और
month
उसके बाद फिर
starting in
फ्राइडे वाले दिन जो है ना
2022,
स्पेशली 8-9 बजे के बाद
what
बहुत ही
if
बुरी
it
बुरी
was the
स्पाइक, और इसमें
employer
से
that
90%
needed,
ब्रोकरों का हाथ होता है।
Governor,
ये
to
खुद
go
मनी
to
मेकर्स हैं
work?
बड़े, थोड़ा पैसा
We're
तो नहीं इनके
going to
पास।
pay
तो
that
ये
backup
किस इनको पता होता है कि
dispatcher
हमारे जो
and take care
लोग
of
हैं
that
उनका एसएल किस
to
डायरेक्शन में है
that
और टीपी
healthcare
किस
option.
डायरेक्शन में है, तो उस हिसाब
The
से
employee
मार्केट को
goes to
ये
work
बड़ा फंड
and
डाल
the
के मूव
business
कराते
is able to
हैं।
thrive.
मोस्ट
So it's
इंपॉर्टेंट, जैसे
mostly
क्रिप्टो के अंदर कॉइन होते हैं, आप उसकी
one-on-one
मर्जी के मुताबिक जो
partnerships
उस कॉइन में
that we're
आप
hoping to
उसकी
share with others
ये
in
सारी चीजें होती तो
2022.
वॉल्यूम के ऊपर डिपेंड करती है ना, डिमांड सप्लाई के ऊपर।
We
जितना
also
वॉल्यूम आ गया इसका
established some
मतलब है कि उसकी सप्लाई
non-traditional
ज्यादा होगी, तो
hours
जितना
for
उसे
family
निकालोगे उस हिसाब
childcare
से
providers.
ये
Those are
चीजें मूव
folks
करती हैं।
that have opened
तो
their
जब
home,
मल्टी
their
जो
businesses in their home to
मार्केट
care
मेकर्स
for
होते हैं वो
children,
मिलके जब
but
कॉल्स
we've
करते हैं,
encouraged
तो
them
ये
to
इनके
think
आपस
about
में
operating
मिलके
during
भी ये
those
कॉल करते हैं
hours
सेम एक प्लेटफॉर्म
overnight.
के थ्रू ना, जो
Hours from
सीओटी रिपोर्ट
5
देता है ना उसके थ्रू। तो
afternoon
इनको फिर
until 3 in the morning
बड़े
so
लेवल
that
पे
the
जो है ना वो
state
गैमलिंग
and
करते हैं, स्पेशली
folks get
क्लोजिंग ऑफ द
the
वीक। ठीक
childcare
है।
that they need. I would say one of the things we're struggling with, and lower income families certainly,
ये डाटा नहीं है भाई।
it's an
ये जो है
unintended
ना वो
consequence, but when we talk about
अपना
universal
स्पीच
preschool,
है,
many of us saw that in President
ये
Biden's
स्पीच है
Build
भाई।
Back Together plan.
और स्पीच का जो है ना वो
It's a wonderful
खुद ही डाटा
option.
निकालना
It's a
पड़ता है
great
क्या है।
option for families, but it doesn't typically cover the 52 weeks a
अब ये
year
देखो ना, इस
of
जगह पे जाके
caregiving.
मार्केट बिल्कुल
At
स्टक हो
Square
गई है।
One, that is what we do. We provide
72 से
52 weeks of
कुछ लोगों
care
ने बाय ली
for
हुई है,
10 to
और
12
वो अपना
hours a
प्रॉफिट
day
बुक
for children and
50%
families
होल्ड
to
कर
be able
सकते।
to go to work. So although it's wonderful for communities to have access to that universal preschool, it requires a partnership with your
और
private
किसी पेयर के बारे
providers
में
to
बताऊं मैं, तब
ensure
तक वो भी
families
एनालिसिस
can
हम कर
stay in
लेते
school.
हैं।
Those
वैसे मैं आपको
preschool
बताऊं कि यूरो
supporting
यूएसडी
basic and
अभी
elementary
डिमांड जोन
school
पे आने वाला है,
activities.
जीबीबी
We
यूएसडी
spent
डिमांड
money
जोन के
there
ऊपर है।
for
आप लोग
this.
जीबी
So
और
that's,
सिल्वर भी डिमांड जोन के ऊपर है।
between
इन
the individual work
करेंसीज
we're
को भी
doing
आप,
at
और
Square One
स्पेशली यूएसडी
and
जेपीवाई को
the
आप सेलिंग
policies we're
अपॉर्चुनिटी
setting
देखें,
in the Commonwealth of
और बन सकती है अभी।
Massachusetts to reduce the paperwork burden, increase the inventory of childcare opportunities. I think
बिटकॉइन जो है ना
our
वो
families
62
are
और
starting
58
to
के
see a
एरिया से अच्छी
change.
बाय आपको दे
It
सकता
is
है।
not a profitable business to be in. The 500 children that are in my care today, 100% of their families are receiving financial assistance. So I serve the very families that you're asking about. It is not easy to maintain this business. I am lucky if I break even. We've reduced, we might have even eliminated all of the processed food on our food menu, Derek. I thought you might like that. But I'm deficiting $50,000 this year in my food. That's just by giving children fresh food versus canned food. You lose a lot of money doing that. So
Wow. So starting from that $50,000
Right.
deficit, what other constraints are organizations like yours currently facing that prevent you from offering services to more families? And then the second part of that question is, how do you see these forces evolving over the year ahead?
I think there's some great news. Massachusetts is certainly leading the way. Most of our federal support dollars post-pandemic have gone away. Massachusetts has chosen to invest state dollars where the federal dollars migrated away. And so we've maintained operational grants. Many of you here may not know that a lot of childcare contracts, especially for agencies like mine, where we serve those very children that need financial assistance, those are multi-year contracts. So the last contract I signed with the Commonwealth to provide my services was close to 12 years ago. And so when you contract for a certain amount of slots,
अच्छा
12
जी,
years ago,
सलाम।
it
बीटीसी
doesn't
यूएसडी का बता दिया
reflect
आपको मैंने, और इसके अलावा
an
जीबीपी,
opportunity to serve
जेपीवाई,
more.
जीबीपी,
And
जेपीवाई
although we have
थोड़ा सा
some
डंप आया है
flexibility,
इसको। आप जब तक
it's
ये
very limited. The other
189 से
piece
नीचे नहीं
that's
जाता
very
तब तक आप
limited
इसको सेल ना
from
करना,
a
फिर दोबारा से
treasury
बाय जाएगा ऊपर
perspective
साइड की।
is
हाँ, इफ्तार टाइम हो गया जी,
we
बिल्कुल इफ्तार
utilized
टाइम
a
हो गया।
market rate
इफ्तारी आप लोग
survey
करें।
to
और
establish the
बहुत
government
सारे मुल्कों
reimbursement
में,
rate
वाकई
that we
पाकिस्तान
were
के अंदर
seeing.
इफ्तारी का टाइम हो चुका है, हमारा भी
In a
बस
lower income
अभी तो हमारा
community
घंटा है
like
पूरा।
Springfield, Massachusetts, the market is the
तो मेरा
government
ये ख्याल है कि
subsidy.
ग्रुप के अंदर ही आके जो है ना
So
अपडेट
your
करते हैं।
market
मैं
rate,
24
when it
आवर्स वाली
becomes the
लाइव
government
चलाता हूँ।
rate,
बाकी जो भी
doesn't
अपडेट होगी वहां पे
advertise
मेंशन
in
करता हूँ,
Square
और
One
जो सिग्नल सेटअप
to
बनेगा
be
वो मैं
able to
ग्रुप के
pay our
अंदर देता हूँ।
bills.
गुड
It
लक।
doesn't match the true.
वहां पे आप लोगों को प्रॉपर जो है ना वो नजर आ जाएगा कहाँ से डिमांड जोन बन रहा है, क्या सब कुछ। वहाँ 24 आवर्स वाली चलाने लगे। तो आप लोगों की सपोर्ट चाहिए, वहां पे लाइक्स करें और शेयर भी करें ब्रॉडकास्ट को। ठीक है, थैंक यू।